Let's move on to economic matters. And one of the big issues here, I think, for voters when you talk to them about what sort of economic stewardship they want, I think a lot of them are interested in the assets that we own already in Auckland. Phil Goff, you told us as Labour Party leader that asset sales were poison. Now you say you won't sell strategic assets, but you will consider the sale of surplus non-strategic assets. What might a surplus non-strategic asset look like?
If you've got unutilised land that could be used for building, of course you'd sell it.
A golf course?
Some people would say if it wasn't for the fact that the Remuera Golf Course had a lease out to 2091, using the ratepayer to subsidise every golf player by $12,000 a year is probably not the best use of the ratepayer's funds. OK, I imagine we can get a little talk about the things that people don't want to sell. Can any of you tell us some things that you would sell, that are sitting there you think, we don't need this, we can swap the capital value of this and buy something else?
Well, I'm talking about swapping, and I'm being very clear that I don't want to wait for government to kind of rain money down on us. I want us to kind of take more control and be more responsible. And I think the argument that was made by Cameron and Partners and EY, two considered reports, said we should look at swapping half the value of our airport shares and the value of the port operating business into assets we'll still own but have a higher priority for, such as that busway I mentioned from Pakuranga to Panmure. Aucklanders would have to approve that in something like a referendum, but that's a way that we control more of our destiny.
OK, we've still got a lot...
control more of our destiny by coming up with plans that actually fund things.
Yeah, we've still got a lot to cover, so I want to shift this debate on economic matters and take in another one of our audience questions, because I know you guys are talking a lot about rate freezes, in some cases rate reductions, and whether or not that will mean a reduction in services. And I think Heather Schotter, the Committee for Auckland, you've got a question along those lines. Good morning to you, Heather.
Good morning. Given your commitment towards fiscal efficiencies, what assurances can you give us that any cost cutting won't compromise council's service performance, given the anticipated growth here in Auckland, which of course leads to increasing demand for services and infrastructure funding?
Yeah. Victoria Crone, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for me, it's about making the use of council's resources. So we've got $60 billion of your money and our future debt every decade, and it's about spending that as wisely as we can, and that's not currently happening. That's number one. So if you clean that up and reprioritise some of the lower spend activities into things like transport, that's what I'm proposing. Number two, though, is it is about broadening the sources of funding, and that's what I bring. So yes, we can certainly work with the government to say, please, can you help us here? And these are the reasons why it works for you and the rest of New Zealand taxpayers. The third is how we bring in public-private partnerships. That's how a lot of cities internationally grow, is they bring forward somebody else's capital spend to get the economic benefit of that early. And the fourth is, as I've mentioned a couple of times, which no one's really cottoning onto, is there's this whole impact investing social capital market emerging globally. There's $17 billion of investment of that, of which a quarter of that's in housing, by the way.
Okay.
So how do we open up all of those sources of funding? We do have to take the pressure off ratepayers and taxpayers and bring in new sources of funding.
John Polino.
You know, look, what's happened in the past 5 years that all of a sudden we had to borrow $5 billion more and our rates are rising drastically? It's the growth plan. It's how we're growing. We're managing it. We're mismanaging it. We're not managing it properly. You know that? You are not responsible for paying for Auckland's growth. That's an investment. And the investment has to be done in a way that we can see where the money's generated. Like when I talk about that satellite city and how that brings us $12 billion a year in household income. You know, Los Angeles is bankrupt. Auckland was modeled after Los Angeles, and the reason why it's bankrupt is because of the way it grew. People are working in too many different areas, living in too many different areas. Can we bring this back specifically,
though, John? You're talking about cutting rates by 10% over the term. How would you do that? Let's get to the crux of it, Heather? How would you do that without compromising a whole bunch of services? Because I think that equates, and tell me if I'm wrong, to something like $175 million less revenue. It's
$145 million.
Okay. Let's take your number, $140 million. What's going to go?
Well, look, in the past 7 months, Stevens Towns has found $70 million in savings. So if he's already found $70 million, I said we're going to cut that budget.
Can you give us a couple of concrete examples about what I would use now as a ratepayer that goes under your plan?
Well, the payroll, for instance, if you look at historical averages,
payroll goes?
The payroll is at 28%. And historical averages show that payroll should be at 24%.
So you cut council staff or wages?
Of course, you've got to put a sinking lid policy on council because we're overstaffed. We increased by 3,000 staff members. That's huge. That's because of inefficiency. Then we have procurements. You know, I'll give you a quick example. Back in 1999, I did the big Christmas tree in AT Square.
No, probably not. Mark Thomas.
Heather, your questions about what commitment will we make to kind of continuing the services, and my response is to say I'll deliver better valuable services. And so we have AT, our tourism economic development business, $60 million a year we spend to that. I don't think they're doing the best job for us in terms of economic development. So I would give that back to business, but give that to the Committee for Auckland and EMA and the Chamber of Commerce to run. So we actually have to reset some of what we're doing. Of that $817 million I mentioned, we spend in planning. In my area, for example, we had 6 months to get a report done, several $1,000
All right,
to
everyone's
tell us.
got their report.
But this is an example to tell us what we couldn't do.
Okay.
$250,000 on arts plan for Auckland, $110,000 on a languages strategy. There are better ways of doing this and delivering more value.
Quick
so
final
that's
word, because we're going to move to some questions. We're going to go to Todd Niall and his our panel of experts for analysis on this very shortly. So, Phil Goff, a quick final word.
To Heather's question, Heather, you're aware as I am that Aucklanders are suffering from rate exhaustion as rates have gone up by double-digit figures. What we've got to do is a number of things. Yes, we've got to find the efficiencies. I'm absolutely convinced there are efficiencies to find in council, including better procurement. But we've also got to have this concept of revenue sharing. When Auckland grows by 45,000, it's a big income earner for GST, income tax, company tax. Where does that go? It goes to central government. Where do the costs of growth fall? They fall on local government, our city. We've got to get the government to come to the party and get a fair share of that revenue if we're getting 50% plus of the country's growth.